I know some people don't really like science fiction. If that's you, I'm sorry. Hopefully you'll still be able to enjoy the bits about the end of the world. So a lot of science fiction is rubbish, I have to admit, but when it's good, I think it offers interesting hypothetical scenarios. So I'm going to start with one of my own. Imagine that you've just got back from work, you're tired, you sit down, and you turn on the news, and it's Boris, and it's the election, and it's Trump, and it's climate change, and Brexit, and there's fires, and floods, and wars, and mass shootings, everything's gone to shit! Turn it off. Relax. Let's watch a movie instead, that'll be nice. Imagine this is my TV remote. We're going to watch a show or a movie. How about A Handmaid's Tale? About a fascist government that grooms sex slaves because pollution has made everyone infertile. Or what about The Hunger Games, in which an ecological disaster has created a fascist elite which enjoy watching teenagers fight to the death with medieval weaponry? Or The Giver, in which societal collapse leads to a fascist government that kills babies outright. Or Elysium, in which the planet is so fucked they have to go and live on the space station instead. Or there's The Rover, set after an economic collapse where people wander around a wasteland shooting each other. Or what about The Walking Dead, where people wander around the wasteland shooting anyone that's not already been eaten by a zombie. Or there's even The Purge, where a fascist government makes it legal to wander around shooting people. Or maybe you'd prefer The Man in the High Castle, where it's not a fascist government in charge, but an actual Nazi government. Nice little twist. You get the idea, sci-fi today is bleak. There's always been plenty of dystopian settings in science fiction, but it's quite hard these days to find something that isn't really pessimistic, and I wanted to know what was going on, so I decided to do a little science experiment, a little science fiction science experiment. I realised, in the words of Matt Damon in The Martian, I'm going to have to science the shit out of this, which is actual dialogue from the film. I soon ran into a problem, which is that I know nothing about science, which may have something to do with watching too much sci-fi, but let's not dwell on that. I realised I was going to have to rely on what I remembered from school, doing science lessons in school, which was quite a long time ago. But as I remember, you always have to start every science experiment with a list of apparatus. So here is the apparatus I used to make this talk, right? First of all, Wikipedia, obviously that's a given. That's where you get facts from. Spreadsheet, that was tedious. IMDb and YouTube. Now I thought about buying all the films I wanted to talk about, but I realised I'd have to start getting stuff from Amazon, which didn't seem right given the whole dystopia thing. So I just watched them for free on the internet. Fingers, eyes, etc. I was kind of scraping the barrel here. I did use them. I just wanted to be thorough with my list. And I imagine this is how they do it at CERN, right? People there sit down every morning and write out a list that says several hundred white lab coats, one large hadron collider, 40,000 biros, etc. Method. Here comes the science bit, as they say in advertisements for hair and beauty products. My method was to compile a list of forward-thinking science fiction, 10 examples from each of the last 7 decades. So it's a mix of books, TV shows and films, and I wanted to go for the big important stuff, the classics that people probably heard of. First of all is the 1950s. This is supposedly the golden age of science fiction. You probably recognise a lot of these, but from the films that came later, whereas the films that were actually released, a lot of them in the 50s, they were kind of mostly about things happening in the present day, like aliens coming to Earth or cities being destroyed by radioactive creatures and very tall women, things like that. But we're interested in the future, so that stuff doesn't concern us. The 60s and 70s, this is a weird mix, right? It's kind of art films and kids shows. There's a few dystopian ideas alongside some more positive stuff like Star Trek and the Jetsons. You'll notice in the 70s, Star Wars is not on this list because it was set a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. So it's disqualified. But in the 70s, you can see it starts dipping into some quite dark stuff, nihilistic stuff like Alien and Judge Dredd, Death Race 2000. In the 80s, it kind of carried on in that vein, except, I don't know if you can see Battlefield Earth, which is a bit of a weird one. It was written by the founder of Scientology, Ron Hubbard, and it's the only sci-fi book I know that comes with a special soundtrack composed by the author. This is Space Jazz. It's a 13-track avant-garde concept album, which maybe you may sort of listen to as you read the book. I've listened to it and it's terrible. So you don't have to. What next? The 2000s, we've got some good ideas here, but they're often accompanied by Tom Cruise, which sort of renders them not because he's a Scientologist, just because he's Tom Cruise. What comes next? Findings. So I went through this list and worked out in each case what was considered the biggest threat to humanity, and I made a graph. First of all, we've got robots. They've always been a quintessential part of sci-fi, but as you can see, it was only in the 80s that they started to be considered a threat, according to my research. Notably, things like the Terminator and Robocop. I think before that, robots were kind of cute and clunky servants that did household chores. Here's Robbie the robot. Here's an unstoppable killing machine. That's what I grew up with. Then we've got aliens. They were once feared as enslavers of mankind and destroyers of worlds. But these days, it seems we're not that bothered by those guys. Likewise, nuclear war. It had its moments. But it's not what it used to be, is it? What's next? Corporate dystopia. It's kind of waxed and waned, which is odd, given that corporations basically rule our world. But fascism is the big fear, and it continues to be up there. Why is that? Now, you can't deny the cinematic appeal of hundreds of extras marching around in matching uniforms, but that can't be the only reason. Maybe all this is a problem of storytelling. Some people argue that optimistic futures are boring, or that drama isn't possible in a perfect world, but I'm not convinced. I don't see why you can't have dramatic action in a world that's better than ours. And you certainly don't need a dystopian story to tell a dystopian setting to tell a good story. So why does sci-fi seem to be on a constant downer? Have we given up on the future, or is there something in our psyche that means we're just titillated by doom? Incidentally, that would make a great name for a metal band. I was going to see them. So when I was thinking about all of this, I started noticing some strange patterns in the data. I realised that if you took the year that any science fiction story was made, i.e. the inception date, along with the year that the story was set, i.e. the story context, you could determine the futuristic interval by applying the following formula. SC minus I equals FI. Mind blown. When I was doing this, well, I'll give you an example. The Matrix was made in 1999 and takes place in the year 2199, which means it has a futuristic interval, or FI, of 200 years. By this point in my discovery, there was all these strange green numbers cascading in front of my eyes, which made it quite hard to see what I was doing. But that is how I knew I'd made an important scientific breakthrough. Now, the more mathematically minded among you might just think this is simple subtraction, and technically that is what it is. But all scientists have to start somewhere, and I started by immediately making another graph. So this one shows all the stories on my list with their corresponding futuristic intervals. So the peaks are when something is set really far in the future. So you look at Planet of the Apes, it is off the chart. I suppose I could have made the chart bigger. But you can see there's this big dip in the 80s here, and it picks up in the 90s. But overall, there's an obvious trend going on. It seems the extent to which we can imagine the future has shortened dramatically over the last 70 years. We no longer tell stories of far-flung, fantastical epochs. We're increasingly concerned only about what's around the corner. And just as sci-fi has got sort of darker and more apocalyptic, it's also got closer to home and closer to now. In other words, I think our collective imagination is finding it harder and harder to envisage a future for our species. Now, I did intend this talk to be fun and light-hearted. It gets worse. And I think the microphone has stopped. Is it working again? Is that any better?
No.
Maybe we should just give up on technology altogether. So as this declines further, presumably, I've calculated this rate of decline since the 60s. I've calculated that in the next decade, we will have a futuristic interval, an average futuristic interval of 3.6, which means sci-fi films released at the start of 2025 will be set in the summer of 2028. And presumably, as it declines further, some movies will be set directly after you finish watching them, which will be interesting. So it seems probable that the average futuristic interval will hit with zero at some point in the subsequent decade. So science fiction's ability to foresee the future will end shortly after the year 2030, which is actually in line with what a lot of scientists say is a tipping point for climate change. So we probably won't need science fiction anymore when we're actually living through a global extinction event, although living is probably the wrong word. I'm aware this joke really needs this talk needs a joke right now. I couldn't think of one. Instead, I'm going to go off on a random tangent. So earlier this year, I went on a tour with my band in Europe, which was really nice. Had a great time. This is bear with me. It's going to loop back eventually. It's going to take a long time. We were in Paris when the Notre Dame was on fire, which they thought was started by a discarded cigarette, which wasn't my fault, by the way. However, seeing this ancient building burning, it affected me in a strange way, and I felt a sense of loss that I couldn't really account for. As we drove past the cathedral, it was still smouldering, so I took this photo to mark the occasion. It seems my bandmates weren't quite affected in the same way. Heartless bastards. To continue the tangent, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history of Notre Dame. It was built between 1163 and 1345, which gives it a futuristic interval of 182 years. In that time, 13 French kings came and went. Builders devoted their whole lives to the cathedral, as did their sons and grandsons and grandsons' grandsons. For comparison, Queen Victoria came to power in England exactly 182 years ago. So imagine if she'd, on her coronation year, commissioned a building that was completed this year. And I was thinking, what effect would that have on our culture's perception of time? 182 years isn't even that long. This is Milan Cathedral. This took 579 years to build. In fact, it took so long that the phrase building the cathedral became local slang for taking a really long time to do something. What are you doing in there? I'm just building a cathedral. But even that isn't that long. Stonehenge, or Stonehenge as it's properly known, was built over the course of 1,600 years. Although mysteriously it seems to have been started and then left for a long time before being finished. Typical British builders. Turn up in the morning and make a mess, knock off for lunch and don't come back for another millennium. The Great Wall of China took even longer, 2,200 years. In terms of thinking ahead, this even beats Planet of the Apes by a couple of centuries. By the way, it's not true that you can see the Great Wall of China from the moon. That's an old myth that was first put around way back in 1794, which, unless you believe in some very niche conspiracy theories, was a long time before we actually got to the moon. Here is what you can see from up there. When astronauts first viewed the Earth from space, it had a profound effect on the way we thought about life back home on the astronauts. And a similar shift in perspective occurred in the minds of many when Apollo 17 brought back these images from space. This photograph is known as the Blue Marble. It was taken in 1972, and it seems to have an almost immediate effect, made people sort of start thinking about humanity and mankind in global terms, and it became a symbol of the environmental movement. Unfortunately, whoever took this photo was an idiot, because they've got it upside down. That's Africa in the middle, pointing upwards. Duh. Luckily, someone clever at NASA switched it around and messed around with the colours to make it look better. This is the image you're probably familiar with. This is the official one. The other one was just the one that was actually taken. So this viewpoint of looking back at ourselves shifted the way we thought about the planet. So maybe a view of ourselves through the lens of a faraway future can change how we think about our actions today. And if we are going to avert a climate catastrophe or solve any of the other problems that we face, we need to be thinking long term. Science fiction isn't doing that. Maybe science can help. In 1986, this guy, Danny Hillis, announced his plan to the world to build a huge mechanical clock in the desert that will run for 10,000 years. His invention was to make people think beyond the barrier of an ever-shortening future. He said his clock would tick once a year, bong once a century, and a cuckoo would come out every millennium. So he's a nut job, right? I want to tell you a little bit about his life. When he was at college, he managed to build a working computer out of an old wooden toy set. He went on to design supercomputers that were 1,000 times faster than anything else around. And when he was at a meeting with the US military, instead of handing out a business card, he gave people a little glass vial containing chains of DNA encoded with his contact information, which is amazing. That was in the 90s. He also held conferences in a treehouse and once drove a fire engine to work, just for the lols. So he might be a nutter, but he's an amazing nutter. His project is called The Clock of the Long Now, and it was actually named by Brian Eno. His plan stalled for ages, years and years, until an investor came in and gave him $42 million. That investor was the Amazon boss, Jeff Bezos. So the clock is either a massive act of hubristic folly, or it could be a profound signal to our species. It could be both, maybe. In any case, they actually started building the clock last year in a hollowed out mountain in Texas. No one knows when it's likely to be finished, but from what I gather, work on the clock is going like clockwork, which I think is a joke we needed earlier. Just in case anyone's forgotten that this is going to be a science experiment, let's skip on to the predictions. A lot of people seem to think sci-fi stands or falls on the predictions, that you can judge it based on the accuracy, but many writers are more interested in warning us against possible futures. And I think sci-fi can be a form of polemic, but I think it's lost its critical edge over time. Modern sci-fi often seems to go for this worst-case scenario without really having anything to say about it. It's like it doesn't even need explaining. If you can hint that there's been a disaster of some kind, then you can get on with the special effects. It's like an apocalyptic setting has become the default setting. It's like an off-the-peg backdrop that everyone understands because they've seen it before. But there's some people that don't see it like this. For some, science fiction isn't about casually accepting a dystopian future or even about trying to stop bad things happening. For the billionaires in Silicon Valley and elsewhere, it's more like a blueprint for the future. These guys, basically. What have they all got in common? We've got Elon Musk, Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos. They're all pretty good with computers. They all like to be photographed against a blue background. They're all unscrupulous billionaires. They're all massive sci-fi fans, basically, and it's the same. You find this a lot with tech pioneers, time after time. There was this book, Snow Crash, came out in 1992, was apparently required reading for Facebook product managers. It was also a personal favourite of Larry Page and Sergey Brin, who founded Google. And this book has been cited as a major influence on the development of things like Google Earth, virtual reality, flat screen TVs, and even credit cards. So the tech industry does have a sincere belief in the power of science fiction, much more than anyone else. Some organisations are now employing science fiction writers to draft potential outcomes for their companies, and even whole industries. So his business models are actually being drawn up based on the predictions of science fiction writers. In 2014, a company that makes these augmented reality headsets actually employed the author of Snow Crash and gave him the title of Chief Futurist, which is one hell of a job title. I would like to know what he does. Conclusion, there isn't really a conclusion, unfortunately. Maybe it's not that science fiction has lost its capacity to inspire exciting futures. Maybe it's just that the people it's inspiring at the moment are mostly the mega rich. And the futures they're excited about aren't necessarily utopias. You have to wonder when these people say that they're big into sci-fi. It's like, did they miss all that stuff about corporations taking over the world? Are they the villains? Maybe they enjoy that stuff, like politicians used to relish seeing themselves and spit an image. This is a car in space. It's a real photo. Elon Musk launched his car into space with a dummy at the wheel, and David Bowie's Space Oddity on the radio. It was a stunt, a publicity stunt, but it's an inspiring one. And his company SpaceX is leading the new space race, and he says it could be ready to put people on Mars by 2026. He's also famously said, Elon Musk has famously said he wants to die on Mars, just not on impact. Along with Bezos and Richard Branson, Musk is thinking big and thinking long term, and it's proving to be infectious. So, has sci-fi failed in providing us with dreams of possible futures? Or has it actually succeeded by encouraging geeky tech guys to come up with these audacious projects? And should we worry that the future is being defined by billionaires? Or is it enough that we might have a future at all? Anyway, it's not the end of the world, but it is the end of my talk. Thank you.